Kethevane, first of all, break it down for us. Who is being hit the hardest here?
Well, look, there are several layers to these new tariffs that Donald Trump is applying. There's a baseline of a 10% tariff to a lot of the countries in the world, bar a few exceptions, that are going to go into effect on April 5th. This is the baseline, and some countries were lucky enough to only get the 10% baseline. That's true, for example, of the UK, Brazil, Argentina, also the UAE or Saudi Arabia. But Trump also added higher, what he calls reciprocal tariffs on about 60 countries that are the so-called worst offenders. So unsurprisingly, topping that chart is China with a total now of 54%. These added tariffs, or the worst offender tariffs, they're going to come into effect on April 9th. But you also have several smaller Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, all hovering around mid-30s to high 40s in their tariffs. And of course, the European Union with 20%. The European Union, which is one of the main targets of Donald Trump. He has repeated many, many times that the European Union was ripping off the United States. No additional tariffs for Canada and Mexico that we've been talking for quite a while. That's because they have their own special 25% tariffs already in place. And there's also a separate 25% tariff on all foreign-made cars coming into the United States, no matter where they're coming from. But when you look into the details of some of these tariffs, there are certain discrepancies and oddities, if you will. One discrepancy, for example, is that Russia is avoiding all forms of tariffs. Now, the White House explains it, saying there are already a lot of sanctions, basically no trade with Russia. That's not completely true. It reduced a lot since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's still about $3 billion worth. And Russia is avoiding those tariffs, while Ukraine, for example, is getting the baseline of 10%. And then you have these small territories that belong to, for example, members of the EU, but are not considered EU territory when it comes to tariffs. That is true of Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, which is a French territory near Canada. They are getting 50% on their exports to the United States, while French Polynesia, for example, is getting only 10%. And for Australia, they're getting, for the Norfolk Islands, 29%. And when you look at some of the exports, for example, Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, they don't export really that much. It's mostly products of the sea, as expected, and very little is exported to the United States. So some of these tariffs sort of beg the question of why these territories or these countries are targeted versus others.
Well, let's